It starts the way these stories almost always do in authoritarian systems, with a decision made quietly, confidently, and at the very top. No press conference, no public debate, just a decree, a signature, and the assumption that the country would absorb it the way it always has. Vladimir Putin has ruled Russia for nearly a quarter century by betting on predictability. People complain privately. State media manages the narrative. Security forces keep the streets calm. This time, that bet failed. The decision itself wasn't framed as dramatic. It never is. It was sold as practical, necessary, even routine. Another step to protect national stability, another sacrifice demanded in the name of the state. But what Putin misjudged wasn't the policy, it was the timing. Russia in this moment is not the Russia of 10 years ago. The pressure has been building quietly: economic strain, war fatigue, sanctions that touch everyday life, and a generation that no longer believes the future automatically belongs to them. When that decision landed, it didn't land on a calm surface. It hit a fault line. Almost immediately, the reaction began to ripple outward. At first, it was small, isolated complaints online, short videos posted and quickly deleted, whispers passed between friends. That's normal. That's how dissent survives in tightly controlled systems. But then something unusual happened. Instead of being smothered, the anger multiplied. One city sparked another, one crowd emboldened the next. And suddenly, what the Kremlin expected to be manageable noise turned into a signal it could no longer ignore. This wasn't outrage driven by ideology. That's the part that makes it dangerous. These protests weren't led by charismatic opposition figures or organized around abstract political ideals. They were fueled by exhaustion, by people who felt they had already given enough and were being asked, once again, to give more while receiving less. When anger comes from lived experience instead of slogans, it spreads faster and cuts deeper. Putin's system relies on a carefully maintained illusion that resistance is rare, isolated, and ultimately pointless. State television reinforces this daily, presenting a country that appears unified, patient, and resilient. But in the hours after the decision, that illusion cracked. Footage began circulating faster than censors could react. Crowds were larger than expected, faces were angrier than usual, and crucially, people weren't leaving when ordered to disperse. That hesitation, the pause before obedience, was the first real warning sign. Authoritarian power doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes when people stop internalizing fear. For years, Russians have learned where the invisible lines are, what you can say, where you can stand, when to look away. This decision pushed too many people across those lines simultaneously. Not because they suddenly became brave revolutionaries, but because compliance finally felt more dangerous than resistance. The Kremlin's response was swift and familiar. Arrests, threats, silence on state media, the usual playbook. But the speed of the crackdown revealed something uncomfortable: panic. Confident governments don't rush to erase evidence. They don't scramble to block networks and flood airways with distractions. They wait. They let anger burn itself out. The fact that this response came so quickly suggests the leadership understood what was happening in real time and didn't like what it saw. What makes this moment different is not just the size of the protests, but the psychology behind them. Many of the people in the streets had never protested before. They weren't activists. They weren't opposition organizers. They were parents, workers, students, people who had spent years adapting, enduring, and staying quiet. Once that group moves, the math changes. These are the people regimes count on to stay home. And then there's the question every authoritarian leader dreads: will the system enforce the order? Power in Russia doesn't come from popularity. It comes from loyalty, especially from those tasked with maintaining control. When videos show police hesitating, when reports emerge of local officials dragging their feet, when enforcement looks uneven, it sends a message far louder than any speech. It tells the public that the wall may not be as solid as it appears. Putin's fatal miscalculation wasn't underestimating anger. It was assuming fear would automatically outweigh it. For years, fear has been his most reliable tool: fear of arrest, fear of losing a job, fear of being singled out. But fear only works when it's one-sided. The moment leaders begin to fear their own people, fear visibility, fear numbers, fear momentum, the balance shifts. Even if these protests are suppressed, the fuse has already done its job. People have seen each other. They've seen how many there are. They've seen that resistance doesn't always end instantly. That knowledge doesn't disappear when the street's empty. It lingers quietly in conversations, in memory, in the understanding that something changed and cannot be fully undone. This is why that single decision matters so much. Not because it will immediately end Putin's rule, but because it shattered the assumption of inevitability. Authoritarian systems survive on the belief that nothing can be different. The moment that belief weakens, even slightly, the future becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one thing strong men cannot control. At first glance, protests in Russia don't seem new. The country has seen demonstrations before. After elections, after arrests, after shocking moments that briefly cut through the fog of state control. Those movements followed a familiar arc. They surged, they were contained, and they faded. The Kremlin learned how to wait them out. That's why this moment matters. Because what's happening now doesn't fit the old pattern. And the system is reacting as if it knows it. The most important difference is who is showing up. These protests are not dominated by professional activists or well-known opposition figures. In fact, many of the people filling the streets have no political identity at all. They are not waving ideological banners or chanting about abstract democratic reforms. They're there because something concrete crossed a line in their daily lives. When movements are driven by lived experience rather than theory, they become much harder to dismiss and much harder to stop. In the past, the Kremlin could isolate dissent by labeling it foreign-influenced, elite-driven, or disconnected from real Russia. That strategy worked because it aligned with what many people already believed. But it doesn't work when the faces in the crowd look like neighbors, coworkers, parents from school pickup lines, when ordinary people see themselves reflected in a protest. The psychological barrier to joining collapses. Another critical difference is geography. These protests aren't confined to Moscow or St. Petersburg, where dissent is often expected and easier to dismiss as metropolitan unrest. They are appearing in regional cities, industrial towns, and areas that traditionally stay quiet. That spread matters because it signals depth, not just visibility. Protest in one major city can be managed. A protest that emerges simultaneously across regions suggests coordination without leadership, a far more dangerous phenomenon for centralized power. And then there's the absence of a single figurehead. Historically, protest movements are easier to neutralize when they revolve around one person. Arrest the leader, discredit them, exile them, and the movement fractures. What we're seeing now is more diffuse. No single arrest ends it. No single speech defines it. That lack of hierarchy makes the movement less dramatic, but far more resilient. Equally important is the emotional tone. Previous protests often carried hope. Hope for reform, hope for change, hope for something better. This wave is driven less by hope and more by exhaustion. People aren't necessarily expecting victory. They're reacting to the feeling that there is nothing left to lose. That mindset is deeply destabilizing for any regime because it removes the incentive to stay compliant. Fear has always been the Kremlin's most effective tool. Fear works best when people believe resistance will only make things worse. But when daily life already feels worse, fear loses its leverage. For many protesters, the risk of staying silent now feels equal to or greater than the risk of speaking out. That's a dangerous equation for an authoritarian state. Technology is also playing a different role. Despite censorship, information is moving faster than before. Short videos, encrypted messages, and personal footage are spreading before authorities can fully suppress them. These aren't polished narratives crafted by opposition media. They're raw glimpses of reality. And raw reality is harder to argue with. When people see crowds that look like them in places like theirs, it changes perception faster than any political argument. What's especially striking is how quickly these protests became normalized in public consciousness. In past moments, people watched from a distance, waiting to see how things would play out. This time, participation accelerated. Each additional crowd lowered the perceived risk for the next. Momentum became social rather than ideological. That kind of momentum doesn't require belief. It only requires recognition. There's also a generational shift at play. Younger Russians have grown up entirely under Putin's rule. They don't remember the chaos of the 1990s that state media constantly invokes as a warning. For them, stability isn't a gift. It's the baseline. When that baseline erodes, the old fear-based arguments lose their power. At the same time, older generations are now facing pressures they didn't expect to still be carrying. That overlap, youth without nostalgia and adults without patience is combustible. The reaction of the authorities reveals how different this feels from the inside. The speed of the response, the breadth of the crackdown, and the effort to suppress even minor visibility all suggest anxiety. Confident power is selective. Insecure power is sweeping. When the state treats every gathering as an existential threat, it tells the public that something fundamental is at stake. Perhaps the most telling difference is what people are learning in real time. They're learning that protest doesn't always immediately fail. They're learning that numbers matter. They're learning that the state doesn't control every variable. Even if these demonstrations are eventually dispersed, that knowledge remains. And once people learn that collective action is possible, even briefly, it becomes easier to imagine it happening again. These protests are different because they are not asking for permission. They are not waiting for a leader. They are not anchored to a single demand that can be negotiated away. They represent a shift in perception more than a list of demands. And perception is the one battlefield authoritarian systems struggle to dominate indefinitely. This moment may not end in dramatic transformation. It may not produce immediate change, but it has already altered the psychological landscape. People have seen that the system is not as immovable as it appears. They have seen that dissent can surface in unexpected places among unexpected people. And once that realization sets in, control becomes harder to maintain. That's why these protests matter. Not because they guarantee an outcome, but because they signal a break from the past. They mark the point where routine unrest turns into something more unpredictable, and unpredictability, more than any slogan or speech, is what truly threatens long-standing power. When power feels secure, it moves slowly, it calculates, it allows pressure to build, because it believes pressure will eventually release on its own. That's how the Kremlin has operated for years. But what we're seeing now is not patience, it's urgency, and urgency is revealing. The speed and scale of the response to these protests tells a story the Russian government would never say out loud. Fear has entered the room. The first clue was how quickly the state moved to shut things down, not days later, not after assessing the scope. Almost immediately. Arrests began before crowds fully formed. Online platforms experienced sudden disruptions. Independent outlets went dark or went silent. State television pivoted hard, either ignoring the protests entirely or reframing them as insignificant disturbances caused by provocateurs. That kind of reaction isn't routine crowd control. It's damage control. Authoritarian systems are designed to project inevitability. The message is simple. Resistance is futile because the state sees everything and controls everything. When the Kremlin reacts this fast, it undercuts that illusion. It signals that events are moving faster than the system can comfortably manage. And people notice, they always do. The arrests themselves are telling. In past protests, authorities often waited, letting people tire themselves out. This time, detentions were immediate and widespread, sweeping up not just organizers, but bystanders, journalists, anyone within reach. That approach has a purpose beyond removing protesters. It's meant to flood the environment with fear. But mass arrests also reveal uncertainty. When you can't identify the core threat, you arrest broadly. When you don't know who matters, everyone becomes a suspect. Then there's the information blackout. The Kremlin has spent years perfecting narrative control. It doesn't just censor, it replaces reality with an alternative version. But this time, the machinery is struggling to keep up. Footage appears, disappears, and reappears elsewhere. Personal videos outrun official statements. The state's voice is louder than ever, yet somehow less convincing. That mismatch is dangerous for a system that depends on perception. The crackdown on digital spaces is especially revealing. Slowing networks, blocking platforms, threatening users, these are blunt instruments. They work best when used sparingly. Overuse signals desperation. It tells people that the government believes visibility itself is the threat, and when visibility becomes dangerous, it also becomes valuable. People begin to understand that what they are seeing matters precisely because someone is trying so hard to erase it. Another sign of fear is inconsistency. Different regions are responding differently. Some local authorities enforce harsh measures immediately, others hesitate, delay, or quietly downplay events. That unevenness suggests a system waiting for direction or avoiding responsibility. Centralized power relies on uniform obedience. Cracks appear when officials begin calculating their own risk instead of simply following orders. Perhaps the most telling response is rhetorical. The language coming from the Kremlin has shifted. Protesters are no longer just misguided or misinformed. They're framed as threats to stability, to sovereignty, to national survival. That escalation in language is intentional. It raises the stakes, but it also reveals how seriously the leadership views the moment. Governments don't invoke existential danger unless they believe something fundamental is being challenged. Fear also shows up in overcorrection. Laws are enforced more aggressively. Minor infractions are punished severely. The state lowers the threshold for what counts as dissent. That strategy is meant to deter participation, but it can backfire. When rules become arbitrary, people stop believing compliance guarantees safety. And once that belief erodes, fear loses precision. It spreads, but it also destabilizes. What's happening behind the scenes matters just as much as what we see on the street. Security forces are being tested, not just physically, but psychologically. Their role depends on confidence that the system they serve is stable and permanent. When protests grow faster than expected and orders come down urgently, that confidence wavers. Even hesitation measured in seconds can change the dynamic of a crowd. The Kremlin's greatest fear is not protest itself. It has survived protests before. The real fear is momentum, momentum that escapes prediction, momentum that doesn't need leaders or slogans, momentum that spreads through recognition rather than organization. Once momentum exists, repression becomes a gamble. Every move carries risk. Every crackdown could either suppress dissent or inflame it further. And this is where fear becomes visible in the smallest details. Streets cleared too aggressively, messages sent too often, silence where reassurance would normally be. These are the tells of a system reacting rather than controlling. The Kremlin wants the public to believe it is calm, deliberate, and in command. Its actions suggest otherwise. Eve. If the immediate response succeeds in emptying the streets, the fear response has already done damage. People have seen how seriously the state took this moment. They've seen how quickly the mask slipped, that knowledge changes behavior. It plants questions. Why now? Why so fast? Why this intense? Authoritarian power relies on the idea that resistance is rare and isolated. The fear response inadvertently confirms the opposite. It tells people that collective action matters enough to trigger the full weight of the state. And once people understand that their presence alone can force such a reaction, the psychological balance shifts. This is the paradox of repression. It's meant to restore control, but it often exposes vulnerability. The Kremlin's fear response doesn't just aim to stop protests. It reveals how much there is to lose. And when a government shows the public what it fears, it teaches them where its weaknesses lie. That lesson doesn't disappear when the streets go quiet. It lingers. It reshapes expectations. And it ensures that whatever comes next will not feel the same as what came before. Authoritarian systems don't usually collapse because of the people in the streets. They collapse when the machinery behind the scenes stops moving in perfect sync. That's what makes this moment so dangerous for the Kremlin. The protests themselves are only part of the story. The more consequential development is quieter, harder to film, and far more threatening. Signs that the system meant to suppress dissent is no longer operating with absolute unity. For years, Putin's power has rested on a simple equation. The public may grumble, but the institutions, security services, regional authorities, courts, media, remain loyal, disciplined, and predictable. That loyalty doesn't require enthusiasm, it only requires obedience. What we're seeing now suggests that obedience is becoming conditional. The first cracks appear in hesitation, not open defiance, not dramatic resignations, just pauses, delays in enforcement, uneven responses across regions, orders interpreted narrowly instead of aggressively. In an authoritarian system, hesitation is not neutral. It's a signal. It tells both the public and the leadership that certainty is slipping. Some regions moved swiftly to suppress protests. Others responded with noticeably lighter tactics, smaller police presence, or delayed action. That inconsistency matters. Centralized power depends on uniform reaction. When local officials begin weighing consequences instead of following instinctively, it suggests they are no longer fully confident that every order will be protected from above. Behind that hesitation is calculation. Regional leaders understand how fast political weather can change. Their loyalty is not ideological, it's transactional. They stay aligned as long as the center looks strong, stable, and permanent. Moments like this force an uncomfortable question. What happens if that permanence is no longer guaranteed? Security forces face a similar dilemma. Their authority relies on certainty, certainty that enforcement will be backed, rewarded, and remembered favorably by history. When crowds are larger than expected and protests spread faster than planned for, that certainty erodes. Officers become more cautious. Lines hold, but barely. and barely is enough to change the dynamic. What's especially striking is the absence of theatrical unity from the top. In past crises, the Kremlin often projected confidence through carefully staged appearances and coordinated messaging. This time, the response feels fragmented. Statements feel reactive. Messaging shifts quickly. Silence fills gaps where reassurance would normally sit. That kind of communication breakdown doesn't happen in a system that feels fully in control. Inside bureaucracies, fear moves differently than it does in public. Officials worry less about protesters and more about blame. Who authorized what? Who failed to act quickly enough? Who will be sacrificed if things go wrong? When internal fear turns inward like that, efficiency collapses, decision-making slows. Everyone waits for someone else to move first. That waiting is itself a crack. Power depends on momentum. The moment momentum stalls even briefly, it invites pressure. Protesters sense it. Observers sense it. And elites, always attuned to shifts in power, sense it most of all. Another warning sign is narrative strain. State media can still dominate airtime, but the story it's telling feels thinner. When a system is confident, it explains events with clarity and repetition. When it's unsure, explanations multiply and contradict each other. Protesters are dismissed as irrelevant one moment and portrayed as existential threats the next. That inconsistency betrays uncertainty about which story will stick. A legal system also reflects stress. Laws are enforced selectively, sometimes excessively, sometimes not at all. New charges appear suddenly. Old rules are revived and stretched. This kind of legal improvisation suggests a system struggling to keep up with reality. When law becomes reactive rather than procedural, it loses authority even as it gains severity. Perhaps the most dangerous crack is psychological. Elites don't need to oppose the system to weaken it. They only need to imagine life after it. That imagination changes behavior subtly but decisively. People hedge, they protect themselves, they avoid irreversible actions, and a system built on unquestioned loyalty cannot function properly once self-preservation takes precedence. History shows that regimes rarely fall at the peak of protest. They fall later when internal. Trust has eroded and coordination fails during the next crisis. What's happening now may look contained on the surface, but beneath it, relationships are being tested and recalibrated. The Kremlin understands this threat, which is why it reacts so sharply to even the suggestion of disunity. Loyalty must not only exist, it must appear absolute. The moment that appearance fades, pressure compounds. Rivals inside the system begin watching each other instead of the public. Silence becomes strategic. Absence becomes noticeable. Even if order is restored in the streets, the internal damage doesn't reset. People remember who hesitated, who disappeared, who overreached. Those memories reshape alliances, and authoritarian systems depend heavily on personal networks and informal guarantees. When trust inside those networks weakens, control becomes more expensive and less reliable. This is why cracks inside the system matter more than crowd size or protest slogans. Crowds disperse. Systems endure until they don't. And the earliest signs of collapse almost always look like confusion, inconsistency, and quiet recalculation rather than open rebellion. What we're witnessing now is not the end of the system, but it may be the end of the assumption that the system is flawless. Once that assumption breaks, every future challenge becomes harder to manage. Every crisis carries more risk, and every decision at the top echoes more loudly through a structure that is no longer perfectly sealed. That's the real danger for the Kremlin, not what people are shouting outside, but what people inside are beginning to wonder and no longer say out loud. Moments that change history rarely announce themselves as such. They don't arrive with clear outcomes or dramatic conclusions. More often they appear ordinary. At first, another protest, another crackdown, another tense standoff that seems destined to fade. But every so often, a moment alters the trajectory, not because of what immediately happens, but because of what can no longer be undone. This may be one of those moments for Russia. The reason this could be a turning point isn't that the protests are guaranteed to succeed. They may not. Streets can be cleared, arrests can be made, order can be restored, at least on the surface. But something more important has already shifted, the perception of inevitability. For years, Putin's power has felt permanent, immovable, almost natural. That sense of permanence is the real foundation of authoritarian control. And once it cracks even slightly, the future stops behaving predictably. What makes this moment different is that too many assumptions collapsed at once. The assumption that people would stay home, the assumption that protests would remain localized, the assumption that fear would outweigh frustration, the assumption that the system would respond smoothly and uniformly. None of those assumptions held. And when multiple pillars fail simultaneously, leaders are forced into reactive mode, responding to events instead of shaping them. Turning points are often psychological before they are political. Right now, millions of Russians are processing something new. The realization that dissent is not as isolated as it once seemed. People saw crowds where they expected silence. They saw protests in places that rarely protest. They saw hesitation where they expected force. That kind of collective realization doesn't disappear just because the streets quiet down. It changes how people interpret the next event and the one after that. Another reason this moment matters is timing. Russia is already under extraordinary strain. Economic pressure, prolonged conflict, international isolation, and demographic shifts have all been pushing against the system at once. Stability has become more fragile, more expensive to maintain. When unrest emerges in that context, it compounds existing stress rather than standing alone. Even small disruptions become harder to absorb. This moment also forces the Kremlin into a strategic dilemma. Repression restores order in the short term, but it accelerates long-term erosion. Concessions might reduce tension, but they signal weakness. Silence creates uncertainty. Every available option carries risk. Turning points often emerge when leaders lose the ability to choose outcomes cleanly and must settle for damage control. Equally important is what this moment teaches people about themselves. Many participants didn't see themselves as political actors before this. They were observers, adapters, survivors. Now they've experienced collective action firsthand. They've learned that showing up changes the atmosphere. That knowledge is powerful, even if it's uncomfortable. Once people cross that psychological threshold, they don't fully return to where they were. History shows that regimes often survive their first major shock. The danger comes later, when the shock reshapes expectations. The next protest feels less impossible. The next crisis feels more volatile. The next decision carries more scrutiny. Turning points don't always end regimes. They begin a new phase where control becomes harder, slower, and more costly. There's also an external dimension. Other governments, investors, and power brokers are watching closely. They don't need protests to succeed to adjust their calculations. They only need to see uncertainty. When a leader who projects absolute control is forced into rapid, visible containment, it alters how allies and adversaries assess risk. That shift influences decisions far beyond the immediate crisis. Inside the system, the consequences may be even more profound. Elites begin asking quiet questions. Not about ideology, but about durability, about timing, about personal risk. Those questions don't require answers to be destabilizing. They only need to exist. Once loyalty becomes conditional, governance becomes more fragile. Turning points are rarely obvious in real time because they don't resolve anything. They complicate everything. This moment hasn't produced a clear winner or a decisive outcome. Instead, it has injected uncertainty into a system that depends on certainty to function. That alone is transformative. Even if Putin remains firmly in power, the terms of that power may be changing. More force will be required to achieve the same level of control. More surveillance, more punishment, more pressure. That escalation cycle narrows options over time. It hardens resistance rather than dissolving it, and it makes future crises more volatile. What makes this moment especially consequential is that it exposed limits to fear, limits to narrative control, limits to institutional coordination. Those limits were always there, but they were abstract. Now they're visible. And visibility changes behavior. This is why analysts talk about turning points not as endings, but as inflection moments. The system bends, and whether it breaks later depends on what comes next. But after an inflection point, nothing moves in quite the same direction again. Russia may emerge from this period outwardly unchanged. The leadership may remain intact. The laws may grow stricter, the messaging louder. But underneath, the relationship between state and society has shifted. Trust has eroded. Assumptions have been challenged. And once that happens, power has to work harder to achieve the same results. That's why this could be a turning point. Not because it guarantees transformation, but because it makes stasis impossible. The old equilibrium, silent, endurance in exchange for predictability, has been disrupted. Whatever replaces it will be less stable, more contested, and far harder to manage. And history shows that when a system enters that phase, the most important changes are often already underway, long before anyone dares to say it out loud.